Imagine living next to someone who constantly destroys your property just because of who you are. It's frustrating, infuriating, and it can make you feel helpless. That's exactly what one black man had to face when his racist neighbor, Karen, kept smashing his mailbox. But instead of backing down, he decided to make a bold move. What did he do? He didn't just replace the mailbox. He replaced it with something that would leave Karen and everyone else speechless. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? James had always believed that peace was something you could find if you worked hard enough. He moved into a quiet, suburban neighborhood hoping to start fresh and build a life away from the chaos. It wasn't a fancy neighborhood, but it was home, or so he thought. At first, things were fine. He'd wave to his neighbors and keep to himself, doing what he could to stay out of everyone's way. But then there was Karen, his neighbor, who seemed to have a problem with him from the start. Maybe it was because James was black. Maybe it was something about the way he carried himself, confident in his success. Whatever it was, Karen didn't like it. It started with his mailbox. One morning, James stepped outside to find it smashed, the pieces scattered across his yard. He assumed it was just an accident. Maybe a kid had been messing around. But when it happened again a few days later, he began to wonder. And then again. After the third time, it was clear. Someone was doing this on purpose. Karen wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She'd stand in her yard, smirking at James as if he should just accept it. But he wasn't going to. Not anymore. The next time, James decided, things would be different. It was the third time James had found his mailbox smashed to pieces. The first time, he told himself it was an accident. Maybe a car had hit it, or some rowdy kids had been messing around. But the second time, that was different. It was clear to him now. Someone had done it on purpose. James had lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for years, and never had he faced anything like this. The neighbors were friendly enough, but no one ever seemed to look his way for too long. They'd wave as they passed, nodding their heads in polite acknowledgement. And that's how James preferred it. He wasn't looking to make waves. But this was different. His mailbox wasn't just an object, it was his. It was his space, his symbol of peace. But someone had decided to attack it. The first few days after the second incident, James didn't know what to do. He called the police, but they said it was likely some kids being mischievous. The officer who had come by seemed nice enough, but he didn't take James seriously. He couldn't. What kind of grown adult calls the cops about a smashed mailbox? The officer seemed to imply that maybe James was overreacting. So, James did what anyone would do. He replaced the mailbox. At first, he felt like a fool paying for another one. He didn't even want to think about how many mailboxes he'd have to replace before this was over. But he was trying to stay optimistic. Maybe it would be the last time. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, a string of accidents. But the second time it happened, James knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. His mailbox had been smashed again. This time, he knew who was behind it. Karen. James had been suspicious of her for a while, but he didn't want to make assumptions. But after this latest attack, it was clear. It wasn't a kid. It wasn't an accident. It was her. Karen had made it her mission to ruin his property. The way she glared at him when they crossed paths, the way she would watch him, eyes narrowed whenever he worked on his yard. Something about her just wasn't right. At first, James tried to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate things. He didn't want to start a fight in a neighborhood where he had hoped to stay low-key and keep to himself. But when he saw his brand-new mailbox torn apart once again, something inside him snapped. He had tried to be patient. He had tried to be polite. But Karen wasn't going to stop. She clearly thought he wouldn't do anything about it. Maybe she thought she had power over him, or maybe she was just a bitter racist woman who had nothing better to do. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. James had enough. The next time he saw Karen in her yard, he could feel the anger rising in his chest. She was out there again, sitting on her porch, drinking coffee, watching him with that same smirk on her face. The one she always wore when she thought she was in control. But this time, he wasn't going to let it go. He couldn't. He walked over to her, his steps deliberate. When she saw him, her eyes lit up, but the look on his face made her pause. "James, what's going on?" Karen asked, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. But James wasn't fooled. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew exactly what was going on. "I think you know what's going on," he said, his voice low, steady. "This has gone far enough. You've been destroying my mailbox, and I want to know why." Karen's face twisted with annoyance. "Oh, please, you're overreacting. It's just a mailbox. It's not like it's anything important." "No," James said, his voice firming. "It is important. It's mine. And you've been smashing it over and over again. Why are you doing this?" Karen's smirk faltered for a second. But it was only a moment before it was back. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she sneered. "You're the one who's been making a big deal out of this. Maybe, if you'd stopped being so sensitive, none of this would have happened." James felt his blood boil. The audacity, the sheer dismissiveness of her words. She wasn't even sorry. She didn't even care. She just wanted to control him, make him feel small. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "I'm done," James said, his words final. "If you want to keep smashing my mailbox, I'm done just replacing it. I'll make sure you can't touch it again." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly thinking he was bluffing. "What are you going to do? Call the cops again?" James didn't answer. He just turned around and walked back to his house. Karen stood there, probably thinking he'd forgotten about it. But she couldn't have been more wrong. James was determined now. He was going to do something that would make it clear to her and everyone else. He wasn't just going to let this go. The next morning, James woke up early. He drove to the hardware store and started buying materials. Steel, concrete, tools. Everything he needed to send a message that no one could ignore. He wasn't just going to replace the mailbox again. No, this time he was going to replace it with something that would make it clear he wasn't going to back down. The work took hours. It was hard, tiring, but James was determined. By the time he was done, there was no question about it. Karen wasn't going to be able to smash his mailbox anymore. He had built a steel wall around it, a solid, unmovable structure that would stand strong, no matter what. James stood back, admiring his work. It wasn't just about protecting his property anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for his right to live in peace. He wasn't going to let anyone push him around, not Karen, not anyone. When Karen came out to see what he had done, her eyes widened. The smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of pure shock. She stood there for a long moment, just staring at the steel wall. You did this?" she stammered. "I did," James said, his voice calm, "and I won't tolerate anyone messing with what's mine again." For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. She didn't say anything. She just turned around and walked back to her house, defeated. And James, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had taken control of the situation. He had stood up for himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could finally live in peace. Days went by after James installed the steel wall around his mailbox. The neighborhood was quiet again, but James knew it wouldn't be for long. He'd made his statement, but the tension in the air was thick. Karen hadn't said a word since she saw the wall, and honestly, James didn't know what to expect next. He had made it clear he wasn't backing down, but what would Karen do? For the next week, nothing happened. James went about his life, getting up early, going to work, and returning home just like he always had. The mailbox wall, though, stood as a constant reminder of the fight that had taken place. Every time James passed it, he felt a little more secure in his decision. But he also knew that no matter how big that wall was, Karen wouldn't be able to leave him alone for long. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Then, one afternoon, as James was leaving work, he saw something that made his stomach churn. Karen's car was parked in front of his house. At first, he thought it was just another one of her usual attempts to provoke him, but then he noticed something different. There was a group of people gathered around the steel wall, the neighbors, people James hadn't seen in weeks, months even. They weren't just standing there. They were talking to each other, nodding and gesturing toward the wall. They were discussing it. And from the looks on their faces, it wasn't just a casual conversation. James's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was going on. For a moment, he thought about turning around and walking the other way. He didn't want to deal with Karen or any of her drama anymore. But something told him he needed to find out what was happening. He parked his car and walked up to the group. As soon as they saw him, the conversation went quiet, and all eyes turned to him. James was used to people looking at him, but this wasn't like the usual glances. It was different. It was like they were waiting for him to say something, as if they were expecting a reaction. Karen was standing there too, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. "Well, well, look who decided to show up," she sneered. "You really think a steel wall is going to stop me?" James stood there, trying to process what was going on. Why were the neighbors standing with her? What was she doing here? And why had they gathered around like this? Before he could say anything, one of the neighbors, Mr. Peterson, an older man who had lived next door to him for years, stepped forward. "You need to listen to us, James," he said, his voice surprisingly serious. "We've been talking, and we don't like what's been happening." James raised an eyebrow, his confusion only growing. "What are you talking about? I thought you were all fine with what Karen was doing to my property." Mr. Peterson shook his head. "We've been watching it all happen, and we didn't say anything. We didn't want to get involved. But we've seen enough. We've seen how Karen has treated you, how she's made your life a living hell over something as small as a mailbox. And we're tired of it." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. Mr. Peterson, one of the neighbors who had always kept his distance, was standing up for him. It didn't make sense. He'd always assumed the people in this neighborhood were passive, that they wouldn't say anything unless it directly affected them. But now, it seemed like things were changing. "Yeah," another neighbor, Miss Arnold, chimed in. "We didn't say anything before, but we should have. We should have backed you up. We're sorry, James." Karen's face turned bright red with rage. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, throwing her hands up. "I don't care what they say. It's still my neighborhood. This wall is an eyesore, and I'm going to make sure it's taken down." But this time, no one reacted the way she expected. Instead of backing her up, the neighbors just stood there, silent but firm in their stance. One by one, they shook their heads and walked toward James, standing with him. James didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was the support he had always wanted, but it came when he least expected it. Karen was alone now, her angry words falling on deaf ears. The crowd of people who had once kept quiet had finally found their voice. "You don't have control here anymore, Karen," Mr. Peterson said, his voice calm but firm. "We've all seen what you've done. We're not going to stand by and let you bully anyone else." James looked around at the neighbors who had gathered around him. They weren't just standing up for him. They were standing up against the toxic behavior that had poisoned the neighborhood for so long. Karen had been allowed to bully people because no one wanted to get involved. But now, that silence was broken. They had finally realized that their inaction had allowed the problem to grow, and now they were choosing to do something about it. James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just the steel wall that was protecting him, it was the strength of the people around him. The power of a community standing together was something he hadn't realized he needed. In a world where people often felt isolated, he had found something powerful: solidarity. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The people who had stood by in silence for so long had finally chosen to speak up. And together, they were strong. Karen was still fuming, but her words didn't have the same power anymore. She was no longer the one in control. She was outnumbered. Her influence had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the collective strength of the community. With a defiant huff, Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath. She didn't say another word to anyone as she marched back to her house. James stood there for a moment, watching her leave. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like things were going to be okay. The community had his back. He wasn't just some guy dealing with a racist neighbor anymore. He was part of something bigger. And together, they had shown that hate could be defeated, not just by one person, but by an entire community standing together. After Karen stormed off that day, James felt a strange calm settle over him. The steel wall still stood in his yard, but it no longer represented anger or frustration. It represented a victory. Not just his victory, but the victory of everyone who had finally found their voice. The neighbors had come together in a way he hadn't imagined possible. And in that moment, James realized that it wasn't just about protecting his property. It was about protecting his dignity. Standing up for himself had ignited something bigger, something that reached beyond the four walls of his home. The next few days passed by quietly. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel the looming threat of Karen's harassment hanging over him. He still had the same daily routines, but everything felt different. The silence in the neighborhood wasn't as uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like the air had cleared. People waved at him in the street more often, their faces less guarded than before. It was as though the community had shifted, and now there was a sense of unity where there once was hesitation. One afternoon, as James worked in his yard, Mr. Peterson came over. The older man, who had once kept his distance, approached him with a smile, a genuine warmth in his voice. "You know, James, I've lived here a long time," Mr. Peterson started, his voice low but kind, "and I've seen a lot of things. But what happened with Karen? That wasn't right. We should have said something sooner. I'm sorry it took so long." James was taken aback. He had always respected Mr. Peterson, but hearing those words from him meant more than he could say. "It's all right. We're all learning, right?" James replied, offering a small smile. "I didn't expect you all to suddenly step up, but I appreciate it." Mr. Peterson nodded. "Well, that's what a community should do. Look out for each other. We don't let one person wreck things for everyone else." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "It's good to see you standing up for yourself. You've got a lot of support here now." James didn't realize how much he needed to hear those words until Mr. Peterson said them. His heart lifted, and the sense of validation he felt was powerful. But even more than that, it was the realization that his decision to act, his decision to put that steel wall up, had made a real difference. It had changed the atmosphere in his entire neighborhood. People were beginning to stand up against intolerance, even if it had taken longer than it should have. As the days went on, James noticed something else. The steel wall, which had once been a symbol of resistance to Karen's cruelty, became a point of conversation for the entire neighborhood. People who had once been afraid to speak out against her were now discussing the issue openly. They weren't just acknowledging what Karen had done. They were actively condemning it. In the months that followed, Karen's influence in the neighborhood weakened. Her attempts to intimidate or belittle others seemed to have less power, and she became more isolated. James's actions had sparked something. It was more than just standing up to a bully. It was about creating a shift in the way people thought about justice, community, and standing up for what's right. And as the months passed, James continued to live his life with the confidence that he had made a real change. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he wondered if the community's support would last, if people would continue to have his back when things got tough. But the truth was, the events that transpired had planted seeds of unity and strength that couldn't easily be undone. One day, Karen tried to come to James' house again. She was seething with rage, ready to make her next move. But when she saw the community standing behind him, neighbors who had once kept quiet, she realized that she no longer had control. Her smug attitude faded, replaced with disbelief. She tried to shout at James to convince him that he was being unreasonable, but the words fell flat. No one was listening to her anymore. And as she stood there, yelling and ranting, James remained calm, no longer affected by her words. He had won. In the end, Karen left the neighborhood. It wasn't through any dramatic confrontation or legal battle. No, it was because she had been forced to realize that the power she thought she had was not only unjust, but it was also fleeting. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They had witnessed James's strength, and it gave them the courage to stand up for themselves. Her reign of intimidation crumbled, not because she had been confronted with violence, but because the community decided together to stop allowing her behavior to dictate their lives. James had never imagined that one simple act, replacing a mailbox, would lead to so much change. What had started as an act of defense, a way to protect his property from someone who thought they could push him around, had transformed into something much bigger. His decision to act had ignited a fire of unity in his neighborhood, and with it came the courage of people who had long been silent. Standing up for what's right often feels like an uphill battle, but James had learned that sometimes it only takes one person to spark a change, one person to say, "Enough is enough." And in that moment his message was clear. We can no longer let hate, racism, or intimidation go unchecked. James's courage, his refusal to be bullied, became a beacon of hope for the entire neighborhood. The lesson wasn't just about the steel wall, though. It was about the strength of a community. It was about standing together, speaking out, and making sure that no one had to fight alone. In the end, James realized that the true power didn't come from the wall. It came from the people who stood with him, and together they had proven that justice, when fought for, could win out over hate and fear. As time went on, things in the neighborhood slowly began to return to normal. James no longer felt the weight of Karen's harassment. The steel wall that had once been a symbol of anger now stood as a symbol of victory. It wasn't just about protecting his mailbox. It was about standing up for what was right. James had faced a situation where hate and intimidation tried to dominate his life, but with courage and the support of his community, he had turned the tables. Karen's actions had sparked something powerful. What started as a small act of defiance against one person grew into a community-wide shift. The neighborhood no longer stood silently in the face of injustice, and James, the man who had simply wanted peace, had unknowingly become the catalyst for that change. So, what do you do when you're pushed to your limits? Do you let the negativity win, or do you stand up, even when it's hard? James showed us that even when the situation feels impossible, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground and let others see your strength. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up for yourself or someone else? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments below. If this story inspired you, like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories that remind us all of the power of community and courage. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Together, we can make a difference.